Before continuing, comment below which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. In 1905, when Redpine County still smelled of green wood, coal smoke, and wet wool, a discreet record was written in dark ink on the margin of a thick-paged book, 44 men, not returned. There were no adjectives, no explanations, just a number, a verb in the past tense, and a silence that spanned decades. It is from this silence that this story is reconstructed. Redpine was, at the time, little more than a cluster of sloping roofs lost on the misty edge of the mountains, surrounded by tall pine trees that always seemed to hide something behind their trunks. The roads were compacted dirt tracks, opened by the force of wagon wheels and horseshoes. There was an unpainted wooden church, a small general store, a sawmill shed, and half a dozen houses scattered among clearings, sparse cotton trees, and vegetable gardens surrounded by crooked fences. At the center of this scene, two figures appear repeatedly in tax records, grocery shopping notebooks, and later accounts: Elijah and Thomas Ward, known, with an irony that seems heavy today, as the Redpine Sisters. There is no consensus among the documents about the origin of this nickname. Some later accounts suggest that it came from the women of the village, who were struck by the silent and close-knit way in which the two brothers moved around together, always half a step behind each other, as if they were a single shadow split in two. Others suggest that it was a taunt from the woodcutters, who found the meticulous rigidity with which they enforced discipline among the workers strange. What is known from accounting records and payroll lists is that the Ward brothers controlled what remained of practical authority in Redpine. They managed the logging contracts on the hillside, decided who received credit at the store, lent tools at veiled interest rates, and, above all, were responsible for a space that is mentioned in very few documents, but always in the same way: the punishment loft. This loft, according to faded sketches found in the Auxiliary Structures folder of the county archives, was located on the upper floor of an old barn with dark boards, about half a kilometer away from the main wagon route. It was a narrow space, accessible by a steep staircase, with a single low window overlooking the pine tree wall. The drawing shows crossbeams, 2 rows of hooks on the ceiling, and a long bench against the wall, but no note explains exactly what the place was used for. At the bottom, someone simply wrote, "Internal use, Ward supervision." The first indirect descriptions of the brothers appear in letters from traveling merchants who passed through the village. In one of them, dated November 1904, a tool salesman writes that, "The Redpine twins don't smile, don't get confused, don't raise their voices. They speak little, but when they do, no one argues." He describes Elijah as the taller of the two, with broad shoulders, a neatly trimmed beard, and a gaze that calculated distances. Thomas, slightly thinner, kept a notebook and pencil in his shirt pocket, jotting down names, cargo weights, and departure times. Together, they established a kind of parallel authority to the county's fragile official forces. The historian who narrates this case, having already gone through dozens of pages of minutes, reports, and private letters, knows that the image of the Ward brothers is not built on dramatic details, but rather on the silent repetition of the same gestures. Signed as a witness, authorized payment, confirmed attendance, applied sanction. The word sanction appears 3 times, always linked to minor delays, fights between woodcutters, missing tools. Next to it, a short note in firm handwriting, forwarded to the Loft. Redpine lived in cycles. At the end of winter, when the snow was melting and the ground was beginning to give way under the mixture of melted ice and mud, groups of men arrived from neighboring regions in search of work in logging. They wrote their names on improvised lists, received a straw mattress in makeshift lodgings, and in exchange for simple food and weekly pay, they spent their days cutting down pine trees, sawing logs, and stacking planks. At night, the village was a collection of dim lights behind thick curtains, muffled voices, and the constant sound of the wind rustling through the branches. In this context, the Ward brothers appear as strangely stable figures. While the men changed with each season, they remained. There are references to their presence in records dating back to at least 1897. Each year, their roles seemed to grow, first as shift supervisors, then as warehouse managers, and finally as official mediators of conflicts between workers and landowners. By 1905, anything involving more than 3 men and 2 tools somehow required Elijah and Thomas's approval. What makes this year different, however, is not a promotion, a marriage, or a fire. It is a hole. In the seasonal workers' Redpine folder, stored in a pale cardboard box, there are carefully handwritten lists with the name of each man hired, his origin, approximate age, and in some cases, simple observations such as good with an axe or avoids drinking. The lists go on for months, the columns repeat, the signatures change. Then suddenly, between the pages referring to the spring and summer of 1905, there is a jump, a gap, numbers that don't add up. At the end of a March list it reads, total men 68. The next page should record the continuity of this contingent, contract renewals, departures, new entries. But what we find is a loose page without a header, with only a column of names lined up in an almost rigid manner. Next to each name, a small vertical line has been drawn, as if to mark their presence. There are no dates, there are no salaries, just the names one after the other, until 44 lines are completed. At the bottom, in handwriting different from that of the rest of the records, is written, allocated for extra work, Loft. When the narrator historian first came across this sheet, many years later, the surface was already yellowed, with moisture stains around the edges. The ink, however, remained surprisingly clear. Some names were common, repeated on other lists, men who had passed through Redpine in previous seasons. Others appeared there for the first and last time. What they all had in common was the same fate noted in silence: extra work in the loft. None of the following sheets mention these 44 men again. On the payroll lists, they are not listed as dismissed or transferred. In the incident reports, there are no records of fatal accidents involving such large groups. In the minutes of the small church in Redpine, there is no reference to a collective funeral, a vigil, or a farewell service. It is as if, after that footnote, their presence had been erased with the same meticulous discipline with which it had been recorded. All that remained was that uncomfortable expression, punishment loft, reappearing in 2 meeting notes, always associated with decisions made by the Ward brothers, and a discreet note in the margin of an October 1905 report, which seems to have been written in a hurry, about the men in the loft, matter closed. It is at this point, precisely at this intersection of silence and dark ink, that the mystery begins to form. Not because of a story told by the stove, not because of a rumor passed down from grandmother to grandson, but because of a set of stubborn absences in the archives that should contain everything. Because, when following the trail of documents, one question becomes inevitable. If 44 men were assigned to the Ward brothers' loft in the spring of 1905, why, from that day on, does the name of none of them appear anywhere again? And why, years later, did someone try to discreetly scrape away with the tip of a blade the word punishment from the term punishment loft in one of the surviving minutes? Reconstructing Redpine's daily life before the disappearance of the 44 men requires patience, because the archives do not tell this part of the story directly. They do not describe emotions, domestic conflicts, or the feeling of waking up to the noise of the sawmill. But by piecing together letters, purchase books, infirmary records, and later accounts, it is possible to reconstruct life in the village week by week and realize that the apparent normality hid small noises that today seem like omens. The routine began before sunrise. The sawmill, located next to the narrow stream that cut through the village, served as a meeting place. At 5:30 in the morning, the first men were already gathering near the door, with weak coffee in metal mugs and pieces of stale bread wrapped in thick cloth. It was an environment where no one spoke loudly. Most woke up tired, with swollen hands, fresh marks from slippery logs, and stiff backs from so many hours of effort. Still, there was a sense of simple camaraderie. Small jokes, muffled laughter, Comments about the weather, the price of salted meat, the next shipment of supplies from Condor Ridge. The Ward brothers almost always arrived before everyone else. Elijah walked with firm, measured steps, looking at everything with calculated coldness. Thomas followed close behind with his notebook clutched to his chest. They did not greet individuals, but wrote down names, checked punctuality, and above all, observed. The historian, analyzing 3 independent accounts, noticed that almost all of them described this same peculiarity. The brothers observed, not in a threatening way, but as if cataloging behaviors, evaluating patterns, identifying deviations. There was, however, one detail that did not appear on the first pages of the archives: the subtle division between the men who caught the Ward's attention and those who were almost ignored by them. In the later testimonies of 2 survivors, workers who had been at Redpine in the previous months but left early in 1905, the same feeling emerges. All it took was a small mistake, an argument, or a delay for one of the brothers to look at them with a different kind of attention. They did not raise their voices or visibly scold them. They took note, and something changed the next day. That something appears in the work schedule lists. 3 men who argued with a foreman were sent to long shifts on the North Slope, the most dangerous. 2 who missed an equipment distribution meeting were assigned heavy cleaning tasks. And on 4 occasions, names were accompanied by the note, Loft orientation, without explanation. The loft, however, was not known to everyone. Many seasonal workers did not even know it existed. From the sawmill floor, you could not see the barn where it was located. The building was remote, gloomy, partially hidden by trees. It is possible that most of the men had only heard about the space in quick conversations, always marked by hesitation. The archives contain no direct descriptions, but letters from merchants mention the Ward barn as a place to store extra tools or supplies. Nothing more. Meanwhile, life in the village followed a rhythm that, at first glance, suggested no tension. Women tended small gardens and dried clothes on clotheslines that swayed in the mountain breeze. The local pastor organized brief Sunday services, always dimly lit, with few voices and much concentration. Children ran between crooked fences, carrying pine bark and small animal bones found in the woods. Traveling merchants would stop for a few hours, sell razor blades, flour and lanterns, and then move on. But there were signs, subtle, fragmented, that something was not quite right. In a letter from February 1905, a woman from Redpine writes to her sister, describing the uncomfortable feeling of living under constant surveillance, although she does not mention who is watching. In another document, the general store records the purchase of an unusual amount of chains, which are not accounted for as maintenance material. In 3 payment lists, small amounts appear for special adjustments to the upper structure, an almost unambiguous reference to the loft, although no one has confirmed this interpretation. The historian mentions a particularly revealing detail. In the March schedules, there is a group of 11 men who are not assigned to specific tasks. Their names appear only as assistants, with no location and no defined function. They are mentioned in quick notes, saying that they should await instructions from the wards. None of them sign in again after April. When cross-referencing this data with later interviews, a common thread emerges. Many workers reported that Elijah had a habit of choosing small groups for special guidance, always at the end of the day, after returning from the woods. It was not public punishment, it was not a reprimand, it was just a call. Silent. The men would leave the lodgings, accompany Elijah or Thomas to a dirt road that led to the darker side of the village, and return hours later, if they returned. Some seemed different the next day, more rigid, more reserved, more tired. Others requested voluntary transfers to outdoor areas, away from the buildings. However, none of this was enough to cause a community uproar. Redpine was a place that survived on hard work, irregular contracts, and an implicit hierarchy that no one dared to openly challenge. The Ward brothers were seen as necessary, albeit uncomfortable. Their methods were accepted without enthusiasm, because the village depended on wood, and wood depended on order, and they, in some way, were that order. Thus, as spring progressed, the records show seemingly ordinary days. New logs arriving, 3 wagons of supplies arriving, a note about the purchase of kerosene, a report on the repair of a makeshift bridge. Nothing indicates what was to come. Nothing foreshadows the void that would open up months later in the archives. But a pattern begins to repeat itself in the documents from the last 15 days before the disappearance. Several names appear with a discrete mark next to them, a small X that does not exist in previous months. These same names disappear in the following pages. The historian, comparing the handwriting, realizes that the mark is not Thomas's, who was usually responsible for the lists, but another hand's. Everything indicates that someone deliberately selected those men. It is precisely these names that would later make up the 44 lines on the loose sheet, the list that mentions extra work, Loft. And if Redpine's daily life seemed stable on the surface, now, with distance, it is impossible to ignore that something was moving beneath this normality, a silent reorganization, a selection funnel, an accumulation of small anomalies that, when put together, point to a common destiny. Everything was moving toward a specific point of tension. And the last week before the disappearance, as the files will reveal, carried signs that none of the men seem to have understood in time. The last week before the disappearance of the 44 men is paradoxically the most detailed and the quietest in Redpine's files. It is as if the documents had been filled out with an almost artificial discipline, very clean lists, very precise schedules, emotionless notes, while at the same time a growing weight insinuates itself between the lines. The historian, rereading these pages for the 20th time, notes that they seem to have been written by someone trying to demonstrate normality, not to record the truth. The days were getting longer, but the forest remained damp and dense, with low fog rising from the ground in the early hours of the morning. The sawmill started operating around 6 o'clock, and the freshly cut wood exuded that strong smell of resin and cold rain. At first glance, nothing would suggest an impending rupture, but several late testimonies, collected decades later with trembling voices, described the same feeling that week, that something was out of place, although no one could say what. On Monday, a worker named Merrill Hannigan reported seeing Thomas Ward walking alone toward the Loft barn before dawn, carrying something wrapped in canvas. The note appears in an interview recorded in 1932, where Merrill states that Thomas seemed more tense than usual, which, coming from a man known for his meticulous coolness, was a detail that caught his attention. At the same time, on that day's list, 5 names appear with an X mark, replacing their usual duties with external assistant. On Tuesday, the sawmill recorded a sharp drop in production. Not for lack of effort, the notes show that all the men were present, but because of unexplained delays in shift changes. In 3 places on the list, there are gaps where the weights of the logs should be. It is as if part of the team had been diverted to another task. At the bottom of the page, in different handwriting, is a short comment: "Adjust night activity." The existence of a night activity does not appear in any other official document. This is the only record, and it was made hastily, in uneven handwriting. On Wednesday, a hiker who spent the night in Redpine reported that, while passing by the side road, he saw light coming from the large window at the bottom of the loft. It was a dim, flickering light, like that of a lamp. He heard muffled sounds, something between shuffling footsteps and wood being moved. He did not recognize any voices. The report was only documented much later, when the hiker, now elderly, was interviewed after the case returned to public debate. His testimony coincides with fresh kerosene stains found years later on the lower floor of the barn, recorded in a belated inspection report. On Thursday, something changes in a more visible way. The Ward brothers suspend the afternoon shift on the north slope, citing the risk of landslides. But curiously, the weather report for that day, still preserved in the archives, indicates stable weather, with no recent rainfall. Even so, 19 men were reassigned to indoor tasks. The materials log shows the removal of 26 meters of thick rope, with no specification of use. The amount is unusual. The village rarely requested so much rope at once. Also, on Thursday, there is the last confirmed mention of one of the 44 men. The name Caleb Rusk appears in a note that seems to have been made by Thomas. Caleb, pending resolved. There are no details. Caleb never appears in any other record. On Friday, the day before the disappearance, the atmosphere described by the few surviving testimonies is almost cinematic in its strangeness. The wind was low, the light was dim, and the village seemed trapped in a heavy silence. The children, according to a resident interviewed years later, were kept indoors as a precaution, although she herself could not explain where this recommendation came from. At 5 in the afternoon, Elijah Ward visited the general store. He asked for 3 extra oil lamps, 2 jugs of oil, and a box of long nails. The merchant wrote in the margin of the page, "Did not seem inclined to talk." This was an unusual observation. Elijah was reserved, but rarely caused explicit discomfort. He left carrying the items without saying another word. By nightfall, the atmosphere was strange. The moon barely pierced the fog, and the road leading to the loft seemed darker than usual, according to later reports. Men crossed the village on their way to their dormitories, while others walked silently in the opposite direction, toward the barn. There is no official document recording this movement, but 3 independent witnesses claim that groups of 5 or 6 went there, accompanied by one of the wards, always Elijah. Around 8 o'clock at night, a prolonged metallic sound was heard coming from the direction of the loft. It was not a scream, it was not a blow. It was more like chains being dragged across wood. A woman who lived about 300 meters from the site claims that she also heard the repetitive, rhythmic beating of a hammer for almost an hour. The curious detail is that she said she did not see any flames through the barn window. The place seemed dark, but the sound was unmistakable. Another witness, a young assistant pastor, claimed to have seen shadows of many men passing through the narrow corridor between the barn and the pine tree wall. He did not recognize them due to the distance and the fog, but said there were many more than usual. His description was noted in a personal notebook found after his death, decades later. At 9:30, there was silence, a deep, almost abrupt silence. No movement, no light. The wind seemed to cease, as if the forest were holding its breath. It is at this point that the records become fragmented. A loose, unsigned document found between 2 pages of the maintenance book contains only the following sentence: "All gathered." Below it, a number, 44. The handwriting is firm, but it does not match Thomas's, nor does it match Elijah's. It is from someone who does not appear anywhere else. Shortly thereafter, the shift log records an extraordinary meeting, with no location or time. No participants are listed. The next page has been torn out, not ripped, but carefully removed, as if someone had used a blade to separate the sheet along the crease. This absence, this page that is not there, is perhaps the biggest break in the archives, because it is precisely on this sheet that the night of the disappearance should be described. At 11:20 p.m., according to the only statement that marks the time, a resident heard a loud but non-explosive sound coming from the loft area. He describes it as wood giving way, a dry crack, a dry echo. There was no fire, there was no smoke, there was no running, just that sound. And then, again, complete silence. It is in this interval between 11:20 p.m. and dawn the next day that 44 men disappear. When the sun finally touched the tops of the pine trees at 6 a.m., nothing seemed out of the ordinary in the main part of the village. A purchase ledger records the arrival of flour. An agricultural report mentions the birth of a calf. But as they walked to the loft, 2 men from the sawmill noticed something strange. The lower door was ajar, as if it had been closed in a hurry. There were drag marks on the floor, wide, deep marks, but no blood, no distinct footprints, just drag marks. They climbed the stairs. Upstairs they found a surprisingly empty space. No tools, no rope, no lamp, just the large window open, letting in the cold morning wind. In the center of the floor, a square of clean dust, as if something large had been removed from there just a few hours earlier. From this point on, all records become confused, overlapping, contradictory. But there is one last clue from that night, perhaps the most disturbing. On the main beam of the ceiling, someone scratched a name with the tip of a metal object. It is difficult to read today, even in the restored archive. But the historian confirmed, with 3 separate analyses, that it is the name of one of the men on the list. And just below the name, a short word, scraped over, but still visible in the oblique light of the scanned documents: dissent. Whatever happened that night in 1905 involved 44 men, the Ward brothers, and a dissent that no one has ever been able to explain, because there was no trail, no trace, no living witness left behind, only silence, and a word hastily carved into the old wood. The morning after the disappearance of the 44 men should, in theory, have caused immediate turmoil. A small town like Redpine, sustained by the labor of those men, could not simply go on as if nothing had happened. But the documents, or what remains of them, reveal something much more disconcerting. In the early hours of the day, almost no one seems to have reacted explicitly. The historian believes this was not indifference, but paralysis. The first concrete note about the event appears in the sawmill log, written by someone who did not identify themselves. Men missing from shift. Just that. No numbers, no alarm. It is a cold sentence, noted next to a list of processed logs. The absence of 44 names appears only implicitly. Lines that were once filled in are now empty. Next, a maintenance report notes that the upper barn is inaccessible, without explaining why. This seemingly mundane sentence contrasts with the testimony of 2 workers who, decades later, claim to have seen the Ward brothers near the barn that same dawn. Elijah was standing in front of the half-open door, looking inside without entering. Thomas was further back, arms crossed as if waiting for instructions. Neither of them said a word. The fact that both were mentioned at the site is important because in the official records of that day, Elijah and Thomas do not appear anywhere. They do not sign any lists, make any warehouse notes, or record any payments. The documentary space left by them is so wide that it seems deliberate, an effort to erase their very presence from the facts. At 9 in the morning, Redpine pastor Samuel Hargrove writes a sentence in the church diary that would become a reference. Something is wrong among the lumbermen. A deep silence hangs over the loft. He does not mention missing persons. He does not speak of disappearance. And curiously, the word loft is partially smudged, as if someone had run their thumb over the still wet ink. It is only around noon that the first explicit mention of the collective disappearance appears. It appears in a hastily written letter addressed to the county official. We have lost contact with a large number of workers, more than 40, and no one can explain what happened. The letter, however, was never sent. It was found 42 years later, folded in 4, inside a hymn book stored under the church pulpit. Why did the pastor write the letter and not send it? There is no direct answer. But records from that night show that Samuel held a brief meeting with local leaders, only 3 residents, where they discussed how to maintain order without panic. Secondary notes from the same meeting say, wait for explanations from the wards. And here begins the most sensitive point of historical reconstruction, the behavior of the Ward brothers in the hours and days that followed. There are at least 6 different testimonies, collected between 1918 and 1937, describing that Elijah summoned a small group of men in the late afternoon of the day of the disappearance. He reportedly spoke little, saying only that there has been a reorganization and that those who are absent will not return to the community. The historian notes that these phrases are so vague that they could have been misinterpreted. But all the testimonies converge on the same expression, will not return. Thomas, for his part, reportedly spent the rest of the day collecting papers, not destroying them, collecting them. According to one of the reports, he removed pages from lists, folded documents, and carried folders. Witnesses describe his attitude as tense, almost hurried, but without losing his composure. Apparently, he knew exactly what he was looking for. In the late afternoon, both disappeared from the residence site. No one knows for sure where they spent the night. They did not sleep in the lodgings, were not seen at the sawmill, and were not at the church. When the sun rose the next day, they reappeared, walking side by side along the main road, as if nothing had happened. And on that same day, they held a closed meeting with county officials, but the content of the conversation was not recorded. 3 days later, the loft was officially closed. The closure appears in a short report, which states, "Structure compromised, use suspended." But an inspection carried out many years later in the 1950s indicated that there was no significant structural damage to that barn. The closure, therefore, was not motivated by the risk of collapse, as the report suggested. It was an administrative decision, and by all accounts, a way to prevent anyone from entering there again. The most disturbing thing, however, is in a report found only in the 1980s, inside a metal drawer in the basement of the old county courthouse. The unsigned document lists objects found inside the loft on the day of the closure. Among them, 3 unlit oil lamps, 2 pieces of wood with deep rust marks, a long, partially bent nail, a fragment of thick rope, cut straight across, a broken pencil, and a small piece of darkened metal, irregular in shape. But the detail that most intrigues historians appears in the last line of the report. On the large window, recent handprints facing inward. It is a simple description, but one full of implications. The marks facing inward suggest that someone or several people were leaning there, pressing their hands against the gap. It may have been desperation, it may have been just an effort to support themselves. But the shape of the marks, according to subsequent analysis, indicates tension. Still, most of the evidence only confirms what was already known. Something happened there. But nothing reveals how or why 44 men disappeared without leaving behind bodies, tools, clothing, or anything else. The most plausible revelation, constructed by the historian after cross-referencing more than 100 documents, interviews, sketches, and gaps, does not point to a supernatural explanation, but to a human pattern common in isolated communities. Decisions made in silence, under internal justifications that never come to light. It is possible, though difficult to confirm, that the Ward brothers led those men to some kind of forced reorganization, clandestine transfer, or extreme punishment that got out of control. There are indications that large groups of workers were, at the time, displaced without formal registration, especially in border areas between counties. But the total absence of tracks, traces, horses used, equipment left behind, makes this hypothesis fragile. Some historians believe that a collective accident may have occurred, a fall on unstable ground, an internal collapse in the upper barn, or even a fatal error in handling equipment. But nothing, absolutely nothing, was found in the surrounding area to support this theory. The final hypothesis, which the narrator prefers to present with caution, does not point to a single moment of tragedy, but to a process, a sequence of decisions, tensions, and disciplinary measures that, little by little, isolated 44 men, concentrating them in a controlled space invisible to most of the village. A process whose outcome was lost not for lack of witnesses, but because everyone involved seemed in some way committed to silence. And it is this silence that constitutes the central revelation of this block. It was not an instantaneous event, but a slow, deliberate construction that led 44 men to a point of no return, and erased with meticulous discipline every step of the way there, a path that began weeks earlier and ended with that word scratched into the beam, descent, as if what happened that night was less a disappearance and more a movement to a place where no one in Redpine dared or wanted to look. Decades later, when the historian sifts through the archives of Redpine with the calm of someone who has grown accustomed to breathing the dust of old books, the story of the 44 men no longer appears as an isolated case, but as a deep crack in the fabric of local memory. There is no monument, no tombstone, no church hymn that mentions their names. Their disappearance is not told to children, does not come up in porch conversations, is neither celebrated nor mourned. It just exists, like a shadow that, for some reason, no one dared to dispel. The historian often says in his personal notes that the most painful part of the archives is not what is written, but what has been omitted. The gaps, torn pages, erased headers, blurred dates, create a sense of emptiness that is not accidental. He realizes that the documents did not age through carelessness. They aged through manipulation, through silence, through a continuous effort to allow time to push the case into the dark corners of history. Still, some pieces have survived. Small fragments that escaped the fingers that wanted to hide them. A warehouse receipt with a marginal note. A piece of rope misplaced in the wrong drawer. The letter never sent, describing men missing. The small sliver of darkened metal that no one could identify. And above all, that word engraved on the loft beam. Descent. For years, the historian tried to interpret this term with documentary rigor. He considered that it could refer to some internal operation, to a cargo transport, to a change in the structural level of the barn. But none of these hypotheses held up. The writing was too hurried, too tense, similar to scribbles made in a state of urgency. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that it was written not as an administrative note, but as the last record of someone who would never speak again. Even so, the truth, if there is one, never appears in its entirety. What emerges, when everything is put together, is a broken mosaic, pieces that don't quite fit together, contradictory accounts, contradictory documents. It is as if, behind any plausible explanation, there is another layer, made not of secrets, but of silence, structured by the community itself. The historian knows that Redpine was a place shaped by survival. In the early 20th century, villages like this one functioned on the basis of fragile alliances, implicit hierarchies, and a deep fear of instability. The Ward brothers, in this sense, were more than supervisors. They were a guarantee. They represented what kept the village together. And when 44 men disappeared under their watch, the priority was not to discover the truth, it was to preserve order. This observation does not appear in any document, but it becomes evident when one observes the behavior of the community in the months that followed. New lists of workers were filled out without reference to those who were missing. Contracts continued to be renewed. The church continued with its brief services. The sawmill resumed its usual noises. Life went on, not out of ignorance but out of necessity. The Ward brothers, on the other hand, remained in Redpine for a few more years. There are no records of punishment, thorough investigation, or removal. They remain in the archives as they continued in life. Constant, silent figures, difficult to interpret. Until, in 1912, both disappear from the lists at the same time. No notes, no warnings, no recorded destination. It is likely that they left for another county, taking their methods and their reserves with them. Or perhaps they simply dissolved into time, like so many other supervisors of remote locations. This is where the historian's reflection deepens. When he revisits the now abandoned barn many years later, the building is leaning, overgrown with moss, and filled with the sweet smell of rotting wood. The staircase leading to the loft creaks under the weight, but still holds. Upstairs, the space seems smaller than the document suggested. There are holes in the ceiling, cracks through which a pale light enters, and dust accumulated in thick layers. There is no sign of a struggle. There is no sign of human presence. Only the large window, wide open as always, from which one can see the endless wall of pine trees. He approaches the beam where the name and the word were carved. He runs his fingers over the shallow groove, feels the roughness, imagines the moment. He does not try to interpret. He just observes, because now he understands that no hypothesis will explain the essential. The truth is not in what happened that night in 1905, but in how the event disappeared in the following months. Redpine didn't just lose 44 men. It lost the record of 44 trajectories, 44 families, 44 memories that could have crossed borders, survived winters, sent letters, raised children, told stories, and instead, there was only silence. A silence so dense that it withstood fires, changes in government, sawmill renovations, the arrival of electricity, the partial destruction of old buildings. A silence that even today hangs over the archives like a thin layer of dust, preventing any firm conclusions from being drawn. The historian carefully closes the final folder. He looks out the window of the research room, where dusk stretches out in shades of gray. He knows that no narrative, not even this one, can fill the void left by 44 missing lives. But he also knows that someone needs to remember, not to solve the case, but to prevent this silence from becoming permanent. Before turning off the light, he writes the last sentence of his report. Some stories don't disappear because there is no evidence. They disappear because everyone who could have told them chose, one by one, to remain silent, and the room remains quiet, as if waiting for the truth on some level to still be coming back through the door. But it never does.